For our emergency debate, Senator Woo.
Thank you, Your Honour. I'm pleased to deliver a speech on behalf of our colleague, Senator Rosa Galvez, the first person appointed to the Senate of Canada from Peru, and someone who knows a bit about Indigenous issues because she is an Indigenous woman from that country. These are the words of Senator Galvez. I rise today to add my voice to the urgent matter of systemic racism in Canada. As the events of the past week have demonstrated once again, Canadians are hurting from institutionalized racism that permeates through departments and agencies, including our police forces across the country. Every week we hear of more cases of police brutality, dismissing of charges of violence against racialized people, and brutal deaths. Every week we learn of an Indigenous woman killed during a wellness check or a black man shot down by police. I find solace in the heavily mediatized conversation on systemic anti-black and anti-Indigenous racism, which allows us to work together on these issues. But I lament the fact that our society has failed in addressing this issue time and time again. I want the discussion to focus on the problems at hand, and I would like to recognize the work of colleagues in the Parliamentary Black Caucus and Indigenous parliamentarians. They are the experts on the matter, and I am ready and willing to support their initiatives to address this matter. It is urgent. As my other racialized colleagues will address the constant barrage of racism people of colour face in Canada, I would like to focus briefly on an aspect of racism that touches on my expertise and that is often misunderstood, yet destroys the lives of entire racialized communities across the country and is closely linked to police violence. It is environmental racism. It is well known that Indigenous, Black and other communities of colour are disproportionately affected by income insecurity, poor public infrastructure and a lack of access to public services. What is less known is that heavily polluting industries tend to be located very close to these communities as well, affecting air and water quality, further compromising these residents' health and well-being. Unlike other countries, Canada does not have a legislated, quote, environmental justice, unquote, lens, and therefore knowledge on the issue is sparse and only recently emerging. The documentary, quote, There's Something in the Water, unquote, recently released highlights the correlation between contaminated well water and elevated cancer rates in the Black community outside of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and other communities of colour which were negatively impacted by water pollution, such as Boat Harbour and Mi'kmaq lands. Please make an effort to watch this video and other documentaries and media coverage that I will mention. For the sake of brevity, I will focus my intervention on some issues faced by racialized communities to illustrate the need to address the environmental dimension of racism in this country. This is relevant to all communities of colour and all Canadians concerned with justice and equality. CBC's Deadly Force investigation found that during a 17-year period, despite only 3 to 4% of the population, Indigenous peoples represented 16% of those killed by police, with the RCMP leading all Canadian police forces in the numbers of killings. The Globe and Mail also found that over a 10-year period, more than 36% of RCMP killings involved Indigenous peoples. Experts warn that since the RCMP does not collect race-based data, this number is likely much higher. Why do we talk about systemic racism? Because to understand underlying causes of this racialized violence, it is important to know the historical and contemporary role played by the RCMP in this country. Canada's first Prime Minister, John Macdonald, created the RCMP's predecessor in 1873 to extend Canada's colonial control over Indigenous territories in what would become Western Canada. In 1885, it joined Canada's military forces in war against different Métis, Cree, Assiniboine and Saulteaux communities in the West. Afterwards, the police played a key role in forcibly relocating Indigenous peoples onto reserves to help clear the way for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The book, Enough to Keep Them Alive, documents how the crystallization of the reserve system and the use of the justice system to criminalize Indigenous peoples was a structural poverty-producing system. But why? For their lands is the reason why. Hazardous waste sites, landfills, incinerators, and polluting industries are disproportionately and deliberately zoned for and developed in First Nations communities. Sarnia, Ontario, known as Chemical Valley, Canada's largest concentration of petrochemical industries and associated water and air pollution, endangering the health of the Anjanam and Walpole Island First Nations. From the mercury contamination of a paper mill in Grassy Narrows to E. coli contamination on Kashashawan Reserve, many communities are beyond the saturation point for exposure to pollutants. Pollution is also systemic violence against people of color. And when Indigenous people stand up to protect their health and relationships to the land, they are criminalized. In recent years, Indigenous peoples have led a number of high-profile movements fighting for social and environmental justice in Canada. Professor Monahan of Carleton University has documented how the police and other security agencies responded by developing a profile surveillance regime that targets Indigenous movements as national security threats. The extensive policing of Indigenous peoples or groups in the so-called War on Terror has been rationalized by the development of categories and labels such as, quote, Aboriginal extremism, unquote, and, quote, critical infrastructure, unquote, specifically to criminalize Indigenous movements that challenge extractive development, demand self-determination, or contest federal and provincial claims to Indigenous lands. In 2013, the RCMP arrested more than 40 members of the Elsipogtog First Nation in New Brunswick for blocking a road to resist shale gas and fracking activity on their territory. In January 2019, and again in 2020, the RCMP invaded Wet'suwet'en territory and arrested land defenders at the Unitstedon camp, sparking solidarity blockades across the country. I will focus on only one example to illustrate the issue and what we can do about it. Indigenous opposition to the Northern Gateway Pipeline. In 2014, the BC Civil Liberties Association filed a complaint against the RCMP for illegally spying on the Idle No More and other opponents of the Northern Gateway Pipeline. Indigenous communities asserting legal jurisdiction over territories coveted by Enbridge came under increased surveillance and were framed as criminal and threats to economic and national security. Under the banner of critical infrastructure protection, our state police functions as the enforcement arm of extractive capitalism in this country. Classified surveillance information was shared by the RCMP and CSIS at energy sector stakeholder meetings organized by Natural Resources Canada, where about half of the 100 participants were from energy corporations. The May 2013 meeting breakfast, lunch and coffee was sponsored by the Gateway Pipeline's applicant, Enbridge. We still don't know the end of it. Part of the case got embroiled in court battles and gag orders, and the RCMP Commission's interim report completed in June 2017 has still not been made public. The Commission cannot prepare a final public report until the RCMP Commissioner responds, which he still has not done 3 years later, an obvious flaw in our legal system. Bill C-3, an act to amend the RCMP Act, was maybe going to close this loophole before Parliament got upended by the pandemic crisis. Bill S-230 was also recently introduced in the other place to address environmental racism. I would propose that moving forward with these legislative initiatives and getting our chamber of sober second thought functioning through using all the technological tools available is the most useful thing we can do to address systemic racism as legislators. We must get our rules in order so that this chamber is never again the place where important bills seeking to enshrine the UNDRIP into Canadian law come to die on the order paper. Honourable colleagues, we are privileged to be members of this chamber. It is my sincere hope that we will use this privilege and order bestowed upon us so that we are not mere tokens of an image of an inclusive and fair society, but that we use our power to be agents of its creation and change for the good of all. Let us play a decisive role in ensuring our country starts to respond to trauma and human suffering, not with more violence, but with transformative caring and justice. I have now read in full a speech by Senator Rosa Galvez, And she concludes by thanking all of you for your attention.